how I planted all of my pots and taped up my jugs, and everything is out in my garden now, getting ready to sprout when it finally eventually gets warm. So what types of plants work well, or what types of seeds I should say, works well with winter sowing? I've read that pretty much anything works with winter sowing. There are people who swear by it, and everything they do, they winter sow. Even like I do the tomatoes and peppers, I told you, I start those in the house. I don't winter sow those. But there are people who swear that winter sown tomatoes and peppers catch up to transplants anyway, and so they would prefer to do it that way. This is where you have to kind of keep in mind your climate, where you live. Do you have a short growing season? Because tomatoes need a fairly long growing season. So is your season short, or is your season like really short? So my season is pretty short. If I were to even winter sow tomatoes, I don't have quite a long enough season that I can get enough tomatoes off of those plants. It's too late in the fall before they start producing. And so I really prefer either starting them indoors, or there's years where I just decide I don't want to do the seeds in the house and I just go purchase them. And that's totally acceptable. But I used to seed all kinds of things indoors. I used to do cucumbers and squashes and all kinds of things, and I just don't anymore. Winter sowing is the way to go. So consider your growing season. How long of a season do you have, and how long of a season does that particular plant need? So what you can do is you can check your seed packets. They'll usually have wording on there like plant early spring, before, as soon as the ground can be worked. Anything that says anything like that is really good for winter sowing, because it likes the early spring. Cold frosts don't bother it. That greenhouse is going to give it a little bit of a head start too. So any perennial plants works really well for winter sowing also. One that I can think of is nasturtiums. I like to have nasturtiums in my garden. It's a flower, because it's really good for, it kind of repels bugs, and it's just something that attracts butterflies. And so nasturtiums do really well with winter sowing. Anything that comes back year after year, chives would be another one that would be good for winter sowing. Herbs, oregano, basil, any of those would be really good for winter sowing. These are all early crops, so they're crops that like cooler weather, and so these are things that are good for winter sowing. Things like broccoli and cabbage, cauliflower, any lettuces or greens, so things like spinach, kale, bok choy. There's like dozens of different types of lettuces, and those would all be really good for winter sowing. Onions from seeds do really well with winter sowing. Now you can buy onions in the little bulbs. I actually don't recommend that. I used to use the bulbs all the time, but sets is another, and it looks more like a root. Seeds, if you want to do seeds, you really have to start them early. So if you're not going to do them indoors, winter sow them, and I've had good luck with onions winter sowing. Herbs, I already mentioned herbs. Radishes would work well. The list really could go on. Anything that is an early crop does really well with winter sowing. There are some crops that I would not recommend for winter sowing, and I have heard that people do these winter sown, but I don't know that they would hold up to the transplanting very well. Things like carrots and beets, those are in the ground crops. Maybe turnips, parsnips, things like that. I have much better luck just seeding them right in the garden. My season works for it, and so I've never tried to winter sow them. Carrots are so teeny tiny, beets are so teeny tiny. I don't know how well they would hold up to the transplant process. If you don't know for sure, give it a try. It's not something that's going to hurt anything, and so seeds are pretty cheap. If you want to, go ahead and give it a shot and let me know if it works for you. I would be interested. So warm weather crops is where you need to keep in mind your climate. This is where my tomatoes and peppers come in. My season is so short, I have to start tomatoes and peppers even earlier than what I would get with the winter sown with the jugs. The jugs give you a head start on the season, but starting indoors gives you even more of a head start. So those crops that need a longer growing season in order to get the fruit, then just think about your season and what's going to work for your climate. There are some warm season crops though that I do winter sow, and I have pretty good luck with it because they seem to fruit early enough for me that I don't have a problem. So I do cucumbers. I do a couple different kind of cucumbers. Table cucumbers is what I call them. I can't remember what the variety is. I like those Armenian long, those great big cucumbers, and then I do pickling cucumbers. And all of those I can do winter sown and they work great. I will also do squash, melons, zucchini. There's really quite a few different things that I do that would be considered a warm weather crop, but they do well with the winter sowing. The one thing I have to do is occasionally, if there's going to be a really late, really hard frost, they'll handle a light frost in the jug. But if it's going to be a really hard frost, I just throw a blanket over the jugs and then they do just fine. This gives them that little bit of extra protection. So make a list, look at what you're going to try to winter sow, check your seed packets, look at both the temperature and the season length, and try it and just experiment and see what works for you.